March 22, 1952, 11:15 p.m. Bumpy Johnson walked into the Metropolitan Club on East 60th Street between Madison Avenue and Park Avenue in Manhattan's Upper East Side, accompanied by 4 associates who had just concluded negotiations with representatives from the Genovese crime family regarding territorial adjustments in East Harlem, and the Metropolitan Club was not a typical destination for Johnson or his associates, because it was a private social club that had been established in 1891 by some of New York's families, and that maintained membership standards designed explicitly to exclude anyone who didn't possess the combination of inherited wealth, elite education, and social connections that defined the city's WASP establishment. But the club had recently opened a street-level bar called the Metropolitan Lounge that operated semi-independently from the main club facilities on the upper floors, and that technically welcomed public patronage, though its prices and atmosphere made it clear that the preferred clientele consisted of wealthy white men who worked in the financial district or lived in the surrounding neighborhoods. The Metropolitan Lounge occupied approximately 2,000 square feet on the ground floor of the club's limestone building, which had been constructed in 1894 and had been designed by Stanford White in the Beaux-Arts style that was fashionable among New York's elite during that period. And the bar had been opened in 1949 as a revenue-generating addition to the club's operations at a time when many private clubs were facing financial pressures due to declining membership and rising operating costs, with the concept being that a public-facing bar on the ground floor could generate income from non-members while maintaining physical and social separation from the exclusive club facilities upstairs, where members gathered without having to encounter people they considered socially inferior. The lounge's interior featured mahogany paneling, leather club chairs, brass fixtures, oil paintings of fox hunts and sailing ships, and a 40-foot bar made of Italian marble. And the prices reflected the establishment's aspirations toward exclusivity, with basic cocktails costing $2 and premium whiskeys costing $5 per glass, amounts that represented approximately 4 hours of wages for average workers in 1952, but that were considered reasonable by the attorneys, bankers, and business executives who constituted most of the bar's regular customers. Johnson had chosen the Metropolitan Lounge deliberately that evening, not because he had any fondness for the pretentious atmosphere or overpriced drinks, but because he had been conducting business throughout Manhattan that night and had noticed the establishment while passing by earlier in the week, and he had made a mental note that despite its location only 15 blocks from Harlem's southern border, and despite operating as a public bar rather than a private club, he had never seen a single Negro patron through its windows. And he had decided, with the methodical curiosity of someone who controlled significant territory and who made it his practice to understand the boundaries of where he was and was not welcome, that he would test whether this absence reflected actual policy or simply the self-selection of potential customers who understood that certain establishments were not designed for them. The bar's clientele at 11:15 p.m. on a Friday evening consisted of 37 men ranging in age from their late 20s to their early 70s, all of them white, all of them wearing expensive suits that marked them as professionals or business owners, and all of them engaged in the kind of loud conversations lubricated by alcohol that characterize late-night drinking in establishments, where men felt comfortable and confident because everyone around them looked and sounded like themselves. When Johnson and his 4 associates entered, the conversations didn't stop entirely, but they diminished noticeably as heads turned to observe the 5 Negro men who had just walked into what was clearly understood by everyone present to be a white establishment, and the bartender on duty, a man named Thomas Blackwood, who was 28 years old and who had been working at the Metropolitan Lounge since it opened in 1949, stared at Johnson and his associates for several seconds, with an expression that combined surprise, confusion, and apprehension. Blackwood was Negro, which was itself unusual. In an establishment like the Metropolitan Lounge, where management typically preferred white bartenders for front-of-house positions that required direct interaction with wealthy white customers, but he had been hired specifically because the club's management believed that having a Negro bartender created an atmosphere of old-fashioned Southern plantation hospitality that appealed to certain customers who associated Negro servants with luxury and refinement, and Blackwood had accepted the position despite understanding that he was being employed partly as a living decoration because the job paid substantially, more than other bartending positions available to Negro workers in 1952, and because he had a family to support and could not afford to reject employment based on the indignity of the circumstances. Johnson approached the bar with the measured, unhurried walk of someone who is accustomed to command, and who moved through the world with the confidence that came from 2 decades of surviving and prospering in environments far more dangerous than an overpriced cocktail lounge on the Upper East Side, and his 4 associates remained near the door with the professional wariness of men whose job was to assess threats and maintain security for someone whose position made him a target for rivals, law enforcement, and anyone else who might see opportunity in violence. Johnson reached the bar and placed both hands on the marble surface, and before he could speak, Thomas Blackwood, who recognized Johnson immediately, because every Negro person in Harlem knew who Bumpy Johnson was and what he represented, spoke in a voice that was quiet and urgent and carried undertones of warning. "Mr. Johnson," Blackwood said while leaning forward slightly so that his words wouldn't carry to the customers sitting at nearby tables. "You don't want to be here. This place has policies. The owner is here tonight upstairs in the club, and if he comes down and sees you, it's going to cause problems for both of us." Johnson looked at Blackwood with an expression that was calm and unreadable, and he said in a voice loud enough to be heard by several nearby patrons, "5 scotches, Johnny Walker, Black Label, neat." Blackwood's face registered conflict as he calculated the consequences of serving Johnson versus refusing him, understanding that either choice carried risks but that refusing service to Bumpy Johnson in front of witnesses was likely more dangerous than facing his employer's anger about serving Negro customers, and he turned to reach for the Johnny Walker bottle when a voice from the other end of the bar called out in a tone that carried authority and contempt, "Blackwood, what the hell do you think you're doing?" The voice belonged to Richard Sutton, age 53, the owner and operator of the Metropolitan Lounge, and a member of the exclusive Metropolitan Club whose family had held membership since the club's founding in 1891. And Sutton was a man whose wealth came from multiple sources, including inherited real estate holdings throughout Manhattan, partnerships in several import-export companies, and investments in the kind of legitimate businesses that generated steady income without requiring much active management, giving him annual revenues estimated at approximately $800,000 and allowing him to maintain the lifestyle of someone who considered work optional and who spent his time managing social clubs, collecting art, and surrounding himself with other wealthy white men who shared his views about proper social hierarchies and the importance of maintaining boundaries between themselves and people they considered inferior. Sutton had apparently been upstairs in the main club facilities when someone informed him that Negro patrons had entered the ground-floor bar, and he had come downstairs to address the situation personally rather than delegating to staff, which suggested that he considered this a matter serious enough to warrant his direct involvement, and he stood now approximately 20 feet from where Johnson remained at the bar, with his face flushed from the alcohol he'd been consuming upstairs, and his expression showing the kind of aggressive confidence that came from decades of never being challenged by anyone he considered subordinate. "Those people need to leave," Sutton said, while addressing Blackwood but speaking loud enough that everyone in the bar could hear him clearly. "We don't serve N** gears in this establishment. We never have, and we never will. And I don't care how expensive their suits are or how much money they think they have. They're not welcome here." The word, spoken with deliberate emphasis and casual cruelty, cut through the bar's ambient noise and created a moment of complete silence, as every patron stopped their conversations and turned to watch what would happen next, and Thomas Blackwood, who was still standing behind the bar with the Johnny Walker bottle in his hand, closed his eyes briefly as if bracing for an explosion that he knew was coming but couldn't prevent. Have you ever witnessed someone make a choice so catastrophically stupid, so publicly and irreversibly so that you could actually see their future collapsing in real time, where they were so confident in their privilege and so secure in their position that they couldn't recognize they were speaking to someone who possessed power they didn't understand and couldn't imagine, someone who would respond not with the immediate violence they expected and could handle, but with something far more devastating and comprehensive that would destroy them systematically over weeks rather than seconds, Subscribe to Timeless Bosses to understand how the most dangerous people are the ones who mistake calm for weakness, who confuse restraint for inability, and who discover too late that real power doesn't announce itself with threats, but demonstrates itself through consequences that are inescapable and irreversible. Johnson remained at the bar with his hands still resting on the marble surface, and his expression showed no anger or outrage or shock, just the same calm attention he might give to someone explaining a business proposition or describing weather conditions, and he let Sutton's words hang in the air for several seconds before responding in a voice that was quiet and measured and somehow more menacing than any shout could have been. "What's your name?" Johnson asked. Not as if he didn't know who Sutton was, but as if he wanted Sutton to introduce himself, formally so that what came next would be framed correctly in everyone's memory. "Richard Sutton," the man said, his voice still carrying aggressive confidence. "I own this establishment. I'm a member of the Metropolitan Club, and I'm telling you to get out of my bar before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." Johnson nodded slowly, as if processing this information and finding it mildly interesting, and then he spoke in that same quiet voice that somehow carried throughout the entire bar, despite its low volume. "Mr. Sutton?" Johnson said. "My name is Ellsworth, Raymond Johnson. Some people call me Bumpy, and I'm going to make you an offer that I suggest you consider very carefully before responding. I'm going to give you one opportunity to apologize to Mr. Blackwood here, and to everyone in this room for what you just said. One opportunity to acknowledge that you used language that is unacceptable and degrading and that reflects poorly on your character and judgment. And if you take that opportunity right now, immediately, then I will leave your establishment peacefully and you will never see me again." Sutton stared at Johnson for several seconds, as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of joke or performance. And then he laughed. A loud, theatrical laugh that was designed to demonstrate to everyone present that he was not intimidated by whatever threat this Negro man thought he was making. "You're going to give me an opportunity," Sutton repeated while still laughing. "You walk into my establishment where you're not welcome. You refuse to leave when I tell you to leave. And now you think you can dictate terms to me like you're somebody important instead of just another anastrisker who doesn't know his place." He used the word again, deliberately and emphatically, making it clear that his first use had not been a slip of the tongue or a momentary lapse, but rather reflected his genuine beliefs and his confidence that he could speak that way without facing consequences. And several of the white patrons in the bar shifted uncomfortably in their seats, because even in 1952 New York, where racism was commonplace and legally permissible, there was something about the repetition of the word and the aggressive tone that suggested Sutton was crossing lines that made even people who shared his prejudices uncomfortable with the public performance of hatred. Johnson straightened slowly and deliberately, removing his hands from the bar and adjusting his tie with movements that were calm and controlled, and he addressed his next words not to Sutton, but to Thomas Blackwood, who was still standing behind the bar, looking like someone watching an inevitable disaster unfold. "Mr. Blackwood," Johnson said, "I apologize that you had to hear that language directed at people who look like us. No one should have to endure that kind of disrespect at their workplace. And I want you to remember what you're about to witness over the next 2 weeks, because what's going to happen to Mr. Sutton is going to serve as an example of what happens when people mistake their privilege for protection." Then Johnson turned back to Sutton and delivered his final statement with the absolute certainty of someone who had already seen the future and knew exactly how it would unfold. "You had your opportunity," Johnson said. "You could have apologized. You could have shown basic human decency. You could have demonstrated that you possess at minimum the capacity for shame when confronted with your own racism. But you chose instead to double down, to repeat your insult, to make it clear that this wasn't a mistake, but rather reflects who you are fundamentally. And now you're going to learn something that people with your kind of privilege rarely learn, which is that money and white skin don't protect you from consequences when you disrespect the wrong person at the wrong time." He paused and let those words settle before continuing. "In 2 weeks, on April 5th at noon, you're going to stand in this exact spot where we're standing now," Johnson said, and he gestured to indicate the marble bar and the surrounding area. "And you're going to apologize publicly to Mr. Blackwood and to every Negro person in New York City for what you said tonight. You're going to admit that you used racist language that was degrading and unacceptable. And you're going to do it in front of newspaper reporters and photographers who will document your apology and publish it where everyone can see it. And you're going to do all of this voluntarily because by April 5th you will understand that apologizing publicly is preferable to watching everything you own and everything you've built collapse completely. Sutton laughed again, but this time the laugh sounded forced and uncertain, and he said, "You're insane. I'm not apologizing to anyone, and if you think you can intimidate me with threats, then you're even more ignorant than I thought." Johnson smiled, and it was the same cold smile that everyone who knew him had learned to fear, and he said simply, "We'll see." Then he nodded to his 4 associates and walked out of the Metropolitan Lounge with the same measured stride he had used to enter it, and behind him the bar remained silent for several seconds before conversations resumed with the nervous energy of people who had witnessed something. They didn't fully understand, but that left them unsettled and anxious about what would happen next. Outside on East 60th Street, one of Johnson's associates, a man named James Porter, who had worked with him for 8 years and who understood his methods well enough to anticipate his thinking, asked the obvious question, "How far do you want to take this?" Johnson, who was lighting a cigarette while standing in the glow of the club's exterior lights, answered without hesitation. "I want Richard Sutton humiliated completely," Johnson said. "I want him standing in that bar in 2 weeks, apologizing on his knees if necessary, admitting to everyone that he's a racist who uses that word casually, and I want it documented so thoroughly that 50 years from now, when people look up Richard Sutton's name, the first thing they find is the story of how he had to publicly apologize for calling people an asterisk. But I don't want his business destroyed. I don't want him bankrupted. I want him alive and functioning and successful, so that every day for the rest of his life he has to live with the memory of being forced to apologize, so that every person he meets knows that story, so that his humiliation is permanent and complete but doesn't allow him the escape of financial ruin or social exile." Porter nodded, understanding that this was a different kind of punishment than Johnson typically imposed, a punishment designed not to eliminate the target, but to mark him permanently with public shame that would follow him through the rest of his life. "That means we need leverage that's strong enough to force him into the apology, but calibrated carefully enough that we don't accidentally destroy him in the process," Porter observed. "Exactly," Johnson said. "We apply pressure in layers, each one more serious than the last, and we give him opportunities to comply at each stage, and we make it clear that the pressure will only increase until he does what we're asking, and we time everything so that by April 5th he understands that apologizing publicly is his only option for stopping the destruction of everything he values." The campaign to force Richard Sutton into a public apology began the following morning at 8:30 a.m., when Johnson placed a call to Frank Costello, and Costello listened to Johnson's account of what had happened at the Metropolitan Lounge with the focused attention of someone who understood that this request would require more subtlety than the usual business of intimidation or elimination. And when Johnson finished explaining his goal, Costello was quiet for several seconds before responding. "You want him humiliated, but not destroyed," Costello said, clarifying the parameters. "That's harder than just putting him out of business, because putting someone out of business is straightforward. You cut off their supply lines and their credit and their customers, and eventually they collapse. But forcing someone to do something publicly against their will, while keeping them viable enough that the humiliation has meaning, that requires precision." Johnson confirmed that this was exactly what he wanted, and Costello agreed to help by contacting several suppliers and service providers that the Metropolitan Lounge depended on, and suggesting that they might want to renegotiate their contracts with Sutton at significantly higher prices, not cutting him off entirely, but making his operations more expensive and more difficult in ways that would create financial pressure without causing immediate collapse. And within 48 hours, Sutton's liquor suppliers had informed him that prices would be increasing by 35% effective immediately due to distribution costs and market conditions, while his linen service had announced that their rates would be doubling because of labor expenses, and his waste management company had notified him that their monthly fees would be increasing by $8 because of new environmental regulations. The second layer involved the Metropolitan Club itself, and Johnson made calls to 3 members of the club's board of directors, all of whom were wealthy white men who had no personal sympathy for Negro causes, but who maintained business relationships with Italian mob families, and who understood that when Frank Costello's organization made requests, it was prudent to comply. And Johnson explained through intermediaries that Richard Sutton had created a public relations problem for the club by using racial slurs in the ground floor bar where non-members could witness his behavior, and that this kind of publicity could damage the club's reputation and potentially attract unwanted attention from civil rights organizations that were becoming increasingly active in challenging discriminatory practices at private institutions. Within a week, Sutton received a formal letter from the Metropolitan Club's board informing him that several members had expressed concerns about incidents at the Metropolitan Lounge that reflected poorly on the club's reputation, and while the board was not taking any immediate action regarding his membership, they wanted him to understand that the club valued discretion and propriety and expected members who operated businesses associated with the club's name to maintain standards that upheld the institution's reputation. And the letter made it clear, without stating explicitly, that if Sutton's behavior continued to generate negative attention, he might face consequences, including potential suspension or termination of his membership, which would be socially devastating for someone whose identity and status depended heavily on his association with one of New York's most exclusive private clubs. The third layer involved Negro churches and community organizations in Harlem, and Johnson contacted 7 pastors and 3 civil rights activists and explained what Richard Sutton had said at the Metropolitan Lounge and suggested that it might be appropriate for their congregations and organizations to understand that certain establishments in Manhattan maintained explicitly racist policies and that the owners of those establishments felt comfortable using the most degrading language possible when referring to Negro people. Within days, several churches had organized what they called a Committee for Dignity in Public Accommodations, which held a protest outside the Metropolitan Lounge on a Saturday evening when the bar would normally be busy with customers, and approximately 150 Negro protesters carrying signs that said Sutton called us an asterisk gears and racist owner inside marched in a circle on the sidewalk while chanting slogans about equality and respect, creating a scene that was photographed by several newspaper reporters, and that resulted in stories in the Amsterdam News and the New York Age describing Sutton's use of racial slurs and characterizing the Metropolitan Lounge as a symbol of the kind of casual racism that civil rights activists were working to eliminate from New York's commercial establishments. The fourth layer involved city health inspectors, and Johnson activated connections with officials in the Department of Health who owed him favors or who accepted regular payments in exchange for their cooperation with various Harlem businesses, and he requested that the Metropolitan Lounge receive thorough inspections focused on any violations that might justify fines or temporary closure orders. And within 10 days, inspectors had visited the establishment 3 separate times and had discovered violations, including inadequate refrigeration temperatures, improper storage of cleaning chemicals, insufficient ventilation in the kitchen area, and minor plumbing issues, resulting in fines totaling $6,500 and warnings that additional violations could result in temporary closure pending corrections. The fifth layer, which proved to be the most psychologically effective, involved Sutton's social circle and business relationships, and Johnson arranged for word to spread through Manhattan's business community about what had happened at the Metropolitan Lounge, not through formal complaints or legal actions, but through the informal networks of gossip and reputation that shaped how wealthy New Yorkers understood each other's character and standing. Business associates began declining lunch invitations with Sutton, citing scheduling conflicts that somehow never resolved. Social acquaintances stopped, including him in dinner parties and charity events. Potential investment partners discovered reasons why proposed ventures wouldn't work. The subtle social exclusion wasn't total or absolute. Sutton remained a member of the Metropolitan Club and retained his core business operations, but the quality of his social interactions had degraded noticeably as people who had previously sought his company now found reasons to maintain distance, calculating that associating with someone who had become notorious for using racial slurs in public carried reputational costs that outweighed any benefits his friendship or partnership might Provide. By March 30th, 8 days after the initial incident, Sutton was facing a perfect storm of moderate pressures that weren't individually devastating but that collectively made his life significantly more difficult and expensive, with increased supplier costs reducing his profit margins by approximately 40%, Metropolitan Club warnings threatening his social status, protests generating negative publicity that reduced customer traffic, health inspection, fines, and violations creating operational headaches, and social exclusion making him feel isolated and defensive in ways that affected his judgment and his mental state. He attempted to fight back by filing complaints with police about the protests, by hiring lawyers to challenge the health inspection findings, and by demanding that the Metropolitan Club defend him against what he characterized as a coordinated harassment campaign. But he discovered that police were reluctant to interfere with peaceful protests that raised legitimate civil rights concerns, that health inspectors stood by their findings, and suggested that perhaps Sutton should focus on correcting violations rather than challenging their authority, and that the Metropolitan Club was more interested in distancing itself from controversy than defending a member whose behavior had created the controversy in the first place. On April 1st, Sutton received a visit from an attorney named David Klein, who explained that he represented certain interests that had been monitoring the situation at the Metropolitan Lounge, and that these interests wanted to propose a resolution that would end the current difficulties Sutton was experiencing. And Klein explained in careful legal language that his clients believed Sutton had made a serious error in judgment on March 22nd by using racially offensive language in a public setting, and that this error had created consequences that were likely to continue escalating unless Sutton took steps to address the underlying issue, and that his clients were prepared to ensure that all current pressures would cease immediately if Sutton would agree to make a public apology for his language and behavior. Sutton, who was sitting in his office above the Metropolitan Lounge, reviewing financial statements that showed his business losses over the previous 9 days, listened to Klein's proposal with growing understanding that he was not dealing with random harassment or coincidental difficulties, but rather with a coordinated campaign orchestrated by someone with enough power and connections to affect multiple aspects of his business and social life simultaneously. And he asked the obvious question that Klein had been expecting. "Who are your clients?" Sutton demanded, though his voice lacked the aggressive confidence it had carried 9 days earlier when he had confronted Johnson at the bar. "That's not relevant to the proposal," Klein responded. "What's relevant is that you currently face a choice between making a public apology that will be embarrassing but will end all current difficulties, or continuing to resist and watching these difficulties escalate into something more serious. My clients have been quite restrained so far. They could have pursued options that would have been far more devastating to your business and your reputation, but they chose instead to give you an opportunity to resolve this through a public acknowledgement of error and a commitment to better behavior going forward." Sutton attempted to negotiate, suggesting that he could make a private apology or donate money to Negro charities or implement new policies at his bar, anything except the public humiliation that Klein was proposing. But Klein made it clear that the apology needed to be public because the offense had been public, that Sutton had used racist language in front of witnesses and had therefore created a public record that required a public response, and that his clients would not accept any resolution that allowed Sutton to avoid the social consequences of his behavior. April 5th at noon, Klein said, presenting Sutton with a prepared statement that Sutton would be expected to read at the bar in front of newspaper reporters and photographers. "You will apologize to Thomas Blackwood directly. You will acknowledge that you used racially offensive language that was degrading and unacceptable. You will express regret for your behavior, and you will commit to treating all patrons and employees with respect regardless of their race, and in exchange for this apology, all current business pressures will cease immediately. The protests will stop, the health inspections will return to normal frequencies, your suppliers will restore standard pricing, and the Metropolitan Club will receive assurances that you have addressed the concerns that generated their warning letter." Sutton stared at the prepared statement for several minutes, reading the words that would require him to admit publicly that he had been wrong, that he had used language that was unacceptable, that he regretted his behavior, and he understood that reading this statement in front of reporters and photographers would create a permanent record that would follow him for the rest of his life. That anyone who searched his name would find stories about the time he was forced to apologize for calling people N***gores. That his children and grandchildren would someday discover this story and would have to reconcile it with whatever image they had of him. And he wanted desperately to refuse to tell Klein and his mysterious clients to go to hell, to stand on principle and resist this humiliation, regardless of the costs. But he was also a businessman who understood costs and benefits, and he had spent 9 days watching his profit margins shrink, and his social standing deteriorate, and his sense of control over his own life evaporate. And he understood that Klein was offering him a clear choice between accepting limited humiliation now or facing unlimited escalation that might destroy everything he had built. And while he hated the choice and resented being forced into it, he was pragmatic enough to recognize that refusing would be catastrophic. "I'll do it," Sutton said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, and he signed the document that Klein provided, committing him to appear at the Metropolitan Lounge on April 5th at noon to deliver the prepared apology in front of assembled media. On April 5, 1952, at 11:45 a.m., Thomas Blackwood stood behind the bar at the Metropolitan Lounge while approximately 30 newspaper reporters and photographers assembled in the space, along with representatives from several Negro civil rights organizations, ministers from 3 Harlem churches, and a crowd of approximately 60 people who had heard about the scheduled apology and who wanted to witness what many were calling the most significant public acknowledgement of racist behavior by a wealthy white business owner in New York history. Richard Sutton arrived at 11:50 a.m. looking pale and nervous, wearing an expensive suit that seemed to hang awkwardly on his frame as if he had lost weight over the previous 2 weeks. And he stood near the bar where he had confronted Johnson 14 days earlier and waited while photographers positioned themselves and reporters checked their recording equipment. At exactly noon, Sutton began reading from the prepared statement that Klein had provided, and his voice was strained and uncomfortable as he spoke words that had been carefully crafted to include every element of public contrition that Johnson had demanded. "On March 22nd, I used racially offensive language in this establishment," Sutton read, his hands shaking slightly as he held the paper. "I used the N-word repeatedly in reference to Negro customers and in the presence of Thomas Blackwood, a valued employee of this establishment, and my language was degrading, unacceptable, and reflected prejudices that I am ashamed to admit I harbor. I apologize to Mr. Blackwood directly for subjecting him to that language at his workplace. I apologize to the Negro community of New York for using language that dehumanizes and insults people based solely on their race, and I commit today to treating all patrons and employees of the Metropolitan Lounge with the respect and dignity that every human being deserves regardless of the color of their skin." He paused and looked at Thomas Blackwood, who was standing behind the bar watching this performance with an expression that mixed satisfaction with lingering resentment. And Sutton added in words that were not part of the prepared statement but that Klein had suggested might demonstrate genuine remorse. "Mr. Blackwood, I am truly sorry for what I said, and I hope that over time I can demonstrate through my actions that I have learned from this experience, and that I can become a better person than I was on March 22nd. The reporters asked questions about what had prompted the apology, about whether Sutton had faced pressure from business associates or civil rights organizations, about whether this represented a genuine change in his attitudes or simply a tactical response to negative publicity. And Sutton answered carefully, acknowledging that he had faced criticism for his behavior and that this criticism had prompted reflection and recognition that his language and attitudes needed to change. And while he avoided mentioning Johnson by name or acknowledging that he had been forced into the apology through coordinated pressure, everyone in the room understood that this public humiliation had not been voluntary, but rather had been compelled by forces that Sutton could not resist. The story of Sutton's apology was covered extensively in both Negro and mainstream newspapers, with the Amsterdam News running a front-page story under the headline, "White Bar Owner Forced to Apologize for Using N-Word," while the New York Times carried a smaller story in its Metro section describing the incident as an unusual example of a white business owner publicly acknowledging racist behavior in response to community pressure, and the photographs of Sutton reading his statement while looking uncomfortable and defeated, became widely circulated images that were reprinted for years afterward whenever journalists needed visual representations of the kind of casual racism that characterized much of American society during the 1950s. Have you ever watched someone learn the hardest lesson of privilege, which is that wealth and social status only protect you from consequences when you're dealing with people who operate within systems you control? But when you encounter someone who operates outside those systems, and who understands how to manipulate the same structures you depend on, suddenly your privilege becomes the rope that hangs you, because the higher you've climbed and the more you have to lose, the more leverage. Someone has to force you into doing things you never imagined you'd be forced to do. Like this video if you understand that true power isn't about avoiding accountability through privilege, but about imposing accountability on people who thought they were too important to ever face consequences, and that sometimes the most effective punishment isn't destruction but forced public acknowledgement that you were wrong, that you behaved shamefully, and that your victims deserve better than you gave them. Richard Sutton continued operating the Metropolitan Lounge for another 7 years before selling it in 1959 to new owners who rebranded the establishment and explicitly welcomed all customers, regardless of race. And during those 7 years, Sutton lived with the permanent mark of his public apology, discovering that everyone he met seemed to know the story, that business associates referenced it in conversations with the kind of casual cruelty that people employ when they want someone to know. They haven't forgotten an embarrassing incident that his social standing had permanently degraded, not because he had been expelled from elite circles, but because he had been marked as someone who had been publicly humiliated and forced to apologize, which was in some ways worse than being cast out entirely, because it meant he remained present in those circles, but diminished, his status forever tainted by the memory of his forced contrition. Thomas Blackwood continued working at the Metropolitan Lounge until 1955, when he used savings and a business loan to open his own bar in Harlem called Blackwood's Tavern, which operated successfully for 23 years and which became known as a place where Negro patrons could drink without facing the kind of casual racism that characterized most white-owned establishments. And Blackwood kept a framed copy of the newspaper article about Sutton's apology hanging behind his bar throughout those years, not as a trophy of victory, but as a reminder that accountability was possible even when legal systems failed to provide it. That Negro people had allies who would defend them even in situations where the law offered no protection. And that sometimes justice came not through courts or legislation but through the kind of systematic pressure that someone like Bumpy Johnson could apply when he decided that a wrong needed to be right. For Johnson himself, the forced apology represented a different approach to addressing racism than the destruction of the Lenox Tavern or the bankruptcy of Harold Whitmore had represented, because this time the goal had not been to eliminate the racist from society, but rather to mark him permanently with public shame that would follow him throughout his remaining life, making him a living example of what happened when you used that word in the wrong place at the wrong time in front of the wrong witness. And Johnson believed that this kind of punishment served purposes that simple destruction could not serve, because it created a cautionary tale that was more nuanced and therefore more widely applicable than stories about businesses being bankrupted or lives being ruined. The incidents also demonstrated Johnson's sophisticated understanding of power and how different situations required different applications of force, because he recognized that destroying every racist who insulted Negro people would eventually create more problems than it solved, by generating accusations of excessive retaliation and by the goodwill and cooperation of allies who were willing to help impose consequences, but who might become reluctant if every incident resulted in total destruction. Whereas forcing public apologies created a middle ground that satisfied demands for accountability without requiring the kind of sustained, coordinated pressure that total destruction demanded. And that allowed Johnson to pick his battles more strategically by reserving complete annihilation for the most egregious offenders, while using forced apologies for people whose racism was significant but not quite worthy of permanent ruin. In Harlem's barbershops and churches and corner stores, the story of Richard Sutton's forced apology became another chapter in the growing legend of Bumpy Johnson, as someone who used criminal power for purposes that transcended criminal enrichment, who defended Negro dignity not because it was profitable, but because he believed it was necessary, who understood that power wielded intelligently and systematically could achieve goals that violence and immediate retaliation could never accomplish, and who demonstrated through actions rather than rhetoric that Negro people in New York had a champion who would respond to insults and assaults not with the kind of uncontrolled rage that racists expected and could dismiss, but with the kind of calculated, methodical, devastating pressure that forced even wealthy white men to stand in front of reporters and photographers and admit publicly that they had been wrong, that they had used language that was degrading and unacceptable, and that deserved the humiliation they were experiencing. The prepared statement that Sutton read on April 5th existed in multiple copies that were distributed to Negro newspapers and civil rights organizations and church groups throughout New York, and some of these organizations displayed the statement in their offices and community centers as educational material demonstrating that accountability for racism was possible even in 1952 when legal protections against discrimination were minimal, and when most Negro people had no recourse against white employers or business owners who treated them with contempt. And the statement served for decades as evidence that the civil rights movement's eventual successes in the 1960s had been preceded by earlier victories that were won not through legislation or court decisions, but through the kind of extra-legal pressure that people like Bumpy Johnson could apply when legal systems failed to provide justice. Richard Sutton died in 1971 at age 72, and his obituary in the New York Times mentioned his role as founder of the Metropolitan Lounge and his membership in the Metropolitan Club, but the newspaper also included a paragraph noting that in 1952 he had been forced to make a public apology for using racial slurs against Negro patrons, and this paragraph ensured that anyone reading about Sutton's life would encounter the story of his public humiliation, making it impossible for his family to remember him without also remembering that moment when he stood in his own bar, reading a prepared statement admitting that he had used the N-word and apologizing for behavior that reflected racial prejudices he claimed to regret. And this permanent marking of his legacy represented exactly the kind of punishment that Johnson had envisioned when he decided that Sutton needed to be humiliated rather than destroyed, needed to live with shame rather than die in obscurity, needed to serve as a living warning rather than a forgotten cautionary tale. The incident on March 22, 1952 had lasted less than 5 minutes, from the moment Richard Sutton called Johnson and his associates N***gores to the moment Johnson walked out of the Metropolitan Lounge. But the consequences of those 5 minutes extended across 14 days of coordinated pressure that forced a public apology witnessed by reporters and photographers and documented in newspapers that preserved the story for future generations. And the story entered Harlem's collective memory as proof that Bumpy Johnson's protection meant something real and enforceable, that insults directed at Negro people under his watch would be answered not just with violence, but with whatever response Johnson deemed appropriate given the circumstances, and that sometimes the most effective response was not elimination, but humiliation, not destruction, but forced contrition, not death, but permanent shame that would follow the offender through every remaining day of his life, as a reminder that privilege without wisdom was just another word for vulnerability when you encountered someone who understood power better than you did.